What would you do if the man you loved sold the one thing most precious to him just to save his family, smiled through his own loss so no one else would feel guilty, and still came home pretending everything was fine with only a new motorbike, tired eyes, and a heart trying very hard not to break? Sometimes the most heartbreaking love stories do not begin with betrayal or a dramatic goodbye. Sometimes they begin with a quiet financial burden, an aging mother, a piece of land tied up in trouble, and a good man standing alone in the middle of responsibility, trying to choose which part of his life he can afford to lose. On one side was Jack's pride, on the other was his family's peace. And somewhere in between, under the ordinary light of a village afternoon, Tu Tien would come to understand that love is not always made of sweet words and grand gestures. Sometimes it is built from sacrifice so quiet it almost goes unnoticed. The day itself began without noise, and perhaps that is why the emotional turn in it feels so real. There was no storm, no shouting, no dramatic crisis bursting through a door, just routine. The kind of routine that makes people believe life is still under control, even when the numbers, the debts, and the private worries have already begun tightening around the heart. At the company, Jack made a call to his accountant, Hoen, and asked her to check the remaining balance in the company account and send him the current numbers by email. His voice was calm, steady, almost ordinary. To anyone listening, it sounded like a boss doing what a boss must do. But the meaning under that conversation was much heavier. He already knew what those numbers would tell him. He had sold his car. He had gathered everything he could gather, and it still was not enough to redeem the land papers and solve the problem weighing on his family. That is such a painful kind of masculinity, isn't it? The kind where a man does the math over and over, not because he expects a miracle, but because he cannot stop hoping the figures will somehow become kinder. Jack knew he could not empty the company fund. A business still had to survive. Salaries still had to be paid. Operations still had to continue. So, even while carrying family pressure on his shoulders, he did not allow himself to become careless with what belonged to others. That alone says so much about who he was. He sat with the thought a little longer after the call ended. The money from selling the car was still not enough. The company account could not be drained. The problem remained. And yet, even in that moment, his mind did not move toward self-pity. It moved toward solutions, toward land, toward work, toward the possibility of sacrificing something else before allowing the burden to fall harder on his mother. Then came a call from Uncle Dung. The older man asked him to come out for a while because he had something important to discuss. Jack agreed immediately. Before leaving, another thought crossed his mind. Quiet and practical, but deeply revealing. Uncle Dung had once asked him to help look for a piece of land in the area, a place where he could build a small farm and live more peacefully. Jack had already checked around, and the available plots were inconvenient, without clear legal papers, without proper roads, without the kind of foundation a late life dream deserved. So on his way out, Jack began thinking of another solution. His own farm was wide enough. Maybe he could give Uncle Dung half. This is where the story becomes beautiful in a very humble way. Because Jack was not thinking like a desperate man trying to hold on to every asset. He was thinking like someone who believed care must move in both directions. If another person wanted to help him, he wanted to find a way to help that person too. Even under pressure, he did not want kindness to become debt. He wanted it to become mutual dignity. He called Dung, the motorbike driver, to come pick him up. Without a car, even a simple trip had become inconvenient. And yet, even that inconvenience did not turn into complaint. Jack accepted it with the silent grit of someone already adjusting to loss before he has had time to grieve it. While waiting, he thought that perhaps later he should buy a second-hand motorbike, just something simple. enough to travel, enough to continue moving. That thought alone carried a strange mixture of sadness and determination. The car had once been part of his image, his years of effort, his attachment, his memory. But now, survival came first. Elsewhere, under the same daylight, Tu Tien was living inside a completely different rhythm. She had gone out early to harvest sapodilla fruit and bring it to the market. The simplicity of that scene matters. While Jack was counting company funds, family obligations, and the cost of losing his vehicle, Tu Tien was in an orchard touching fruit, checking ripeness with her hands, picking the ones ready to be sold, saving the best one for him without even needing to explain why. There is something deeply moving about that contrast. One person was carrying pressure in figures and documents. The other was carrying love in fruit, in effort, in the small instinct to set aside the sweetest thing for the person she cared about. At the roadside meeting point, Jack finally met Uncle Dung. The older man did not waste time. He had already gone and bought back Jack's car. That gesture changed the atmosphere immediately. There it was, the car that had been sold, the car that had traveled with Jack through years of work and life, the car he had let go of because he believed he had no other choice. And now it was standing there again, returned not by fate, but by someone who cared enough to intervene. Uncle Dung told him plainly that a man like Jack could not be left without transportation. The vehicle was necessary. More than that, it had been part of Jack's life for so long that watching it disappear had felt wrong. He wanted to help. He wanted Jack to take it back and use it as before. It was an act of kindness, and Jack knew it. He received it with gratitude. But gratitude is not the same as acceptance. That conversation between them is the moral center of the first half of the story, because it reveals Jack's character more clearly than any speech ever could. He did not reject the car out of pride alone. He rejected it because he knew what accepting it would cost Uncle Dung. The older man still carried his own dream, buying land, building a small farm, perhaps finally stepping into a quieter chapter of life. Jack had known about that dream for some time, and he could not bear the thought that his own crisis would interrupt it. So even while clearly moved, even while surely feeling the ache of seeing his old car again, Jack told him no. Not rudely, not dramatically, but with the kind of respectful firmness that hurts both people in the conversation. He said he understood the kindness behind the gesture. He said he would always remember it, but he could not take the car back. If he accepted it, then Uncle Dung's own hope would be delayed, perhaps damaged. And Jack had already decided that hardship was something he would carry himself before letting it spread to someone who had only tried to help. That is a very lonely kind of goodness. Uncle Dung urged him not to think too much about money. He insisted that he only wanted to support him a little, but Jack still would not cross that line. Instead, he offered something unexpected and generous in return. If Uncle Dung still wanted to build a farm, then he could take half of Jack's land. The farm was wide enough, there was room, and more than that, there was emotional meaning in the offer. The land would place Uncle Dung closer to Jack's mother. That detail gave the scene its deepest tenderness, because Jack knew, even if he did not say it in a sentimental way, that Uncle Dung had feelings for his mother. He knew his mother was aging. He knew old age becomes gentler when it is not lonely. So the land was not merely a property arrangement. It was a quiet blessing, perhaps even a bridge toward a future where his mother might have companionship, stability, and warmth near the people who cared for her. Uncle Dung was surprised, then visibly moved. His own dream of a small farm had always been modest, a place to work with his hands, a place peaceful enough to grow old in, a place from which he could, perhaps one day, openly bring Jack's mother into a life built with tenderness rather than pretense. Hearing that Jack supported such a future left him emotional in the restrained way older men often are. In the end, the car remained with Uncle Dung for the time being. Jack suggested he keep it and use it, even to help take Jack's mother around when needed, especially since another driver had recently quit. It was one of those solutions that carried sacrifice and care at the same time. Jack lost the comfort of getting back what he had sold, but he gained the quiet relief of knowing his refusal had protected someone else's dream and perhaps even helped his mother's future. When the conversation ended, there was no triumph in it, only a sober kind of peace. Jack left without the car, carrying both gratitude and loss in the same chest. And that is exactly how mature love, family drama should feel. Not clean, not easy, but emotionally honest. After that, the day moved into another register entirely. Tu Tien was at the market, sitting beside her baskets of sapodilla, calling out to customers, weighing fruit, answering the same simple questions again and again. Were the fruits ripe? How much for a kilo? Were they sweet? Had they ripened on the tree? Could someone choose softer ones? Would she add one more piece to make the price round? The exchange was repetitive, ordinary, even slightly noisy. Yet hidden inside it was the dignity of labor. She had gone out early, picked with care, sold with patience, smiled through the heat, and earned what she could. And all through that time, she kept thinking of Jack. She had saved the biggest fruit for him. That small action says everything. Love, in her world, was never abstract. It became something you wrapped and carried home. Something you set aside before selling the rest. Something you remembered in the middle of work. Meanwhile, Jack went to buy a motorbike. The scene at the used vehicle shop was practical, even plain. He looked through second-hand models, asked about documents, checked the engine, tested the condition, compared prices. There was no glamour in it, no attempt to preserve status. He chose a modest used bike, accepted the seller's offer, received a free helmet, checked the paperwork, and paid. In a single quiet transaction, one chapter of his life formally ended and another began. That moment matters not because of the bike itself, but because of what it symbolizes. Jack was adjusting downward without bitterness. He was shrinking comfort to preserve responsibility. He was allowing his life to become smaller in appearance so that the people depending on him would feel less fear. And then, on the road, he met Tu Tien. She was just returning from the market when she saw him on the unfamiliar motorbike. She almost did not recognize him at first. They stopped at a drink stall nearby, a very simple place, nothing decorative, nothing dramatic, just two coconuts, a shaded table, the sound of a village afternoon moving lazily around them. But emotionally, this is the softest and strongest part of the story, because here, finally, Jack told the truth. He explained that he had sold the car, not because he wanted to, but because he needed money to redeem the land papers for his mother and ease the financial strain. He admitted that he had told her earlier the car was being repaired because he did not want her to worry too soon. Now, with the motorbike parked beside them and no point in hiding reality any longer, he chose honesty. Tu Tien's reaction was exactly why the scene works so well. She did not accuse him. She did not become childish or dramatic. She was startled, yes, saddened, certainly. But what came through her first was empathy. She understood instantly that selling that car must have hurt him more than he was willing to say. She remembered how attached he had been to it. She understood that he had been acting strong not because he felt nothing, but because he did not want her or his mother to carry extra worry. Then Jack told her about Uncle Dung buying the car back for him and about his refusal to accept it. He explained the farm dream, the land, the decision to give Uncle Dung half of their farm so he could build a life there and live closer to Jack's mother. Tu Tien listened carefully, and what is so lovely here is that instead of resisting the idea or feeling threatened by another bond entering the family circle, she immediately saw the goodness in it. In fact, she confessed that she had been thinking the same thing herself. If someone had treated them with sincerity, then they too should answer with sincerity. That moment marks the emotional maturity of their relationship. It is no longer the stage of love where two people only think about each other in isolation. Their love is now connected to parents, land, money, shared burdens, old age, and the practical architecture of a future life. Romance is still there, yes, but it has already deepened into partnership. Then Tu Tien did something even more touching. She offered Jack her own money. It was not much, she admitted. The market gave her only a small income. But small things, gathered together, could still become help. She had offered before, and he had refused before. This time, she asked him to let her stand beside him properly, let her contribute, let her carry part of the burden instead of only watching him shoulder everything alone. That is the exact emotional pivot your script wanted. Love proven by action, not just language. Jack looked at her and finally agreed. Not because the amount itself would solve everything, but because accepting help is sometimes its own act of love. It is a way of saying, I trust you enough to let this become our struggle, not just mine. In that acceptance, their relationship moved quietly from affection into solidarity. They finished their drinks. She teased him lightly by paying for them. He told her to put on the helmet. He told her to hold him tightly on the motorbike so she would not fall. She climbed on behind him, and that image, so simple, so familiar, so rural, so tender, contains the whole spirit of the story. No luxury, no grand victory. Just a man who has given up much, a woman who chooses to stay, and a road home still waiting ahead of them. And maybe that is why this story lingers in the heart, because it understands that real love is rarely the brightest part of life. More often, it is the part that remains steady when life becomes dim. It is the fruit saved from the market basket, the land shared instead of hoarded, the car refused so someone else's dream can live, the truth finally spoken over coconuts at a roadside stall, the small savings offered with trembling sincerity, the arms that hold tighter on the back of a motorbike because the future is uncertain, but the choice to stay is not. In the end, dignity and love do not stand against each other. They protect each other. Jack's dignity did not make him cold. It made his sacrifice honest. Tu Tien's tenderness did not make her weak. It made her brave enough to share the burden. And perhaps that is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. The deepest kind of love is not the one that shines most beautifully in times of abundance. It is the one that still chooses gentleness when money is short, when pride is wounded, when family responsibilities press in from every side, and when two people must learn that building a life together means carrying not only each other's joy, but also each other's unfinished pain.